What would you do if you had to choose between your dignity and your child's life? Elizabeth Morgan stood in the center of Millbrook's dusty town square, her bare feet planted on the wooden platform where livestock was usually sold. In her trembling arms, she held her 8-month-old daughter Lucy, whose tiny face was flushed with fever. Above them, a crude wooden sign swayed in the autumn breeze. For sale. But this wasn't about cattle or horses. This was about a desperate mother who had run out of every other option. The townspeople gathered around the platform in a mixture of shock, disgust, and morbid curiosity. Some whispered behind gloved hands, others shook their heads in judgment. A few looked away entirely, unable to witness what desperation could drive a human being to do. "Please," Elizabeth's voice cracked as she addressed the crowd. "My baby needs medicine. She's dying, and I don't have anywhere else to turn." What none of them knew, what Elizabeth herself couldn't have imagined, was that a stranger was riding into town at that very moment. A man whose simple act of human decency would not only save her life, but transform it in ways she never thought possible. This is the story of a woman who sacrificed everything for love, and the cowboy who showed her that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. It's a tale of second chances, unconventional proposals, and the kind of love that grows not from passion, but from profound respect and understanding. Because sometimes the best deals aren't made with money. They're made with the heart. 3 days earlier, Elizabeth Morgan had been a woman with hope. She'd walked into Dr. Mitchell's office carrying Lucy, believing that somehow, some way, she'd find the money for her daughter's medicine. The baby's fever had been climbing for a week, and her tiny chest rattled with each labored breath. "It's pneumonia," Dr. Mitchell had said, his weathered face grave as he examined the infant. "Without proper treatment, she won't last another week." "How much?" Elizabeth had asked, though her stomach already knew the answer would be more than she could afford. $25. For the medicine and follow-up care. $25 might as well have been $25,000. Elizabeth had exactly 37 cents to her name, the remnants of what she'd earned washing clothes for the hotel. Her husband James had been dead for 6 months, killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts and a baby to feed. She'd tried everything, begged the bank for an extension on the loan, pleaded with her landlord for more time, even swallowed her pride and asked the church ladies for help, only to be told that charity was for deserving families. And apparently the widow of a man who died owing money didn't qualify. That's when the idea had come to her, terrible and desperate, and the only option left. Elizabeth had heard whispers about such arrangements, women in impossible situations who made impossible choices. The frontier was a hard place, and sometimes survival required sacrifices that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. So here she stood, on the auction platform where prize bulls and breeding horses were usually displayed, holding her dying baby and offering herself to whoever had $25 and was willing to claim both of them. "Starting bid is $25, she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. For both of us. I'll cook, clean, and..." She swallowed hard. "I'll be whatever kind of wife you need. Just please, someone help my baby." The crowd murmured uncomfortably. A few men stepped forward, their eyes calculating, but before anyone could speak, the thunder of hooves interrupted the proceedings. A lone rider approached from the east road, his horse kicking up dust clouds that caught the afternoon light. He was tall and lean, wearing a brown duster that had seen better days, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Everything about him spoke of long miles and hard living, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity that set him apart from the usual drifters who passed through Millbrook. Daniel Carter had been riding for 3 days straight, pushing hard to reach the next town before his supplies ran out. He'd been following rumors of work on a cattle ranch north of here, but when he crested the hill and saw the crowd gathered in the town square, curiosity got the better of him. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman, young and pretty despite the weariness etched into her features, stood on the auction platform holding an obviously sick baby. The "for sale" sign above her head made his stomach turn with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Dan had seen a lot of desperate situations in his 32 years, but this cut deeper than most. Maybe it was because the woman couldn't be much older than his sister Sarah had been when she died. Maybe it was the way she held herself, proud despite her circumstances, protective despite her powerlessness. Or maybe it was simply because he'd been raised by a mother who taught him that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who couldn't help themselves. He dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the hitching post with deliberate care. The crowd parted as he approached the platform, sensing something different about this stranger. He wasn't looking at Elizabeth the way the other men were, like she was merchandise to be evaluated. He was looking at her like she was a human being in trouble. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and calm, with a slight Texas drawl that spoke of wide-open spaces and honest work. "Might I ask what's brought you to this?" Elizabeth's eyes met his, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't encountered in months, genuine concern without judgment. It nearly broke her composure entirely. "My baby is dying," she whispered. "The medicine costs $25, and I don't have it. I've tried everything else." Dan's jaw tightened as he looked at the sick child in her arms. Lucy's labored breathing was audible even from where he stood, and her skin had the grayish pallor that spoke of serious illness. "And you think this is the answer?" he asked gently. "It's the only answer I have left." Dan looked around at the crowd, noting the mixture of hungry anticipation and moral superiority on the faces surrounding them. These people were enjoying the spectacle, feeding off another person's desperation like vultures. It made him sick. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elizabeth Morgan. This is Lucy." "Well, Mrs. Morgan, I think we can find a better solution than this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet, counting out bills with steady hands. $25, more than many men made in a month. But Dan had been saving for months, planning to buy his own piece of land. Those plans could wait. "Here," he said, holding out the money. "For the medicine." Elizabeth stared at the bills in disbelief. I can't just take your money. You don't even know me." "Sometimes that's exactly when you should help someone," Dan replied, "when there's nothing in it for you except doing what's right. But I have nothing to give you in return." Dan was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Then he said something that would change both their lives forever. "Actually, there might be something we could work out, something that would help us both." The crowd leaned in, sensing drama, but Dan ignored them entirely. His attention was focused solely on the woman and child who had somehow, in the space of a few minutes, become the most important people in his world. "I have a ranch about 50 miles north of here," he said. "It's not much, just a cabin and some grazing land, but it's mine, free and clear. Problem is, it's too much work for one man, and I'm tired of living alone." Elizabeth's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we could help each other out. I need someone to help run the household, maybe help with the animals when needed. You need security and a safe place to raise your daughter. Could be we're both looking for the same thing, just from different directions." "You're talking about marriage." "I'm talking about a partnership," Dan said carefully. "A business arrangement, if you want to call it that. You'd have your own room, your own space, no expectations beyond what you're comfortable with. But you and Lucy would be provided for, protected, and you'd never have to stand on a platform like this again." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elizabeth felt her heart pounding so hard she was afraid Lucy would feel it. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Dan's eyes grew distant for a moment, as if he were seeing something from long ago. "Because I know what it's like to lose family, and because I believe everyone deserves a chance to start over." Before Elizabeth could respond, a voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "Now hold on just a minute." Mayor Blackwood pushed through the gathered townspeople, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as a man of influence. Behind him came two other men Elizabeth recognized with growing dread. Marcus Webb and Tom Bradley, the collectors who'd been hounding her for weeks about her late husband's debts. "This woman owes money to half the businesses in town," Blackwood announced loudly. "She can't just waltz off with some stranger without settling her accounts." Dan's posture shifted subtly, but Elizabeth could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Are you saying she's not free to leave?" "I'm saying she has obligations, debts that need to be paid." "How much?" Dan's voice was deadly quiet. Webb stepped forward, consulting a ledger. $47.36, including interest and collection fees. Dan didn't hesitate. He reached back into his wallet and counted out the remaining bills, plus some coins from his pocket. There, paid in full. The crowd murmured in amazement. In the space of 5 minutes, this stranger had spent more than $70, a small fortune, on a woman he'd never met. Blackwood's face darkened. Just who do you think you are, mister? Someone who minds his own business. I suggest you do the same. Dan turned back to Elizabeth, ignoring the mayor's glare. The offer stands, Mrs. Morgan, but it's your choice to make. Elizabeth looked down at Lucy, whose breathing seemed to have worsened in just the past few minutes. Then she looked at the faces in the crowd, some sympathetic, others judgmental, but all of them treating her situation like entertainment. Finally, she looked at Dan Carter, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she'd been afraid to voice. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll accept your proposal. Dan nodded once, then stepped onto the platform and gently took Lucy from her arms. The baby was so light, so fragile, that he felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. Let's get this little one to the doctor first, he said. Everything else can wait. As they walked toward Dr. Mitchell's office, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for survival, but for something better. Something like a real life. She didn't know that Daniel Carter was wondering the same thing. Looking down at the baby in his arms and thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd found what he'd been searching for without even knowing he was looking for it. Behind them, the crowd slowly dispersed, their entertainment over. But Mayor Blackwood remained, watching the unlikely trio with calculating eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Elizabeth Morgan might think she'd found salvation, but Blackwood knew the truth. No one left Millbrook without paying the real price, and he'd make sure of it, one way or another. But for now, walking beside a man who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than she'd received in 10 months, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe that sometimes miracles really did come riding into town on dusty horses, wearing worn boots and carrying generous hearts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new revelations about the man who had saved her life. But today her daughter was going to live, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The ride to Dan's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Elizabeth had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass stretched toward distant mountains, and cottonwood trees lined the creek beds with their leaves turning gold in the fading light. Under different circumstances, she might have enjoyed the scenery, but right now all her attention was focused on Lucy, who rode in her arms while Elizabeth sat sideways on Dan's gentle mare, Buttercup. The baby's fever had broken thanks to Dr. Mitchell's medicine, but she was still weak and fussier than usual. Every little whimper made Elizabeth's heart clench with worry. Dan rode alongside them on his stallion, keeping pace with the slower horse and checking on them every few minutes. He'd barely spoken since they left Millbrook 3 hours ago, but his silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt protective, like he was giving her space to process everything that had happened. Elizabeth stole glances at him as they rode. In the town square, her desperation had made everything feel surreal, but now she was beginning to truly understand what she'd agreed to. She was riding into the unknown with a complete stranger, trusting him with her life and her daughter's future, based on nothing more than his actions in a moment of crisis. What kind of man spent his life savings on strangers? What kind of man offered marriage to a woman he'd known for less than an hour? The rational part of her mind whispered warnings, but the practical part, the part that had watched her daughter nearly die while she stood helpless, told her to be grateful and stop asking questions. As the sun began to set, they crested a small hill and Dan's ranch came into view. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. A sturdy log cabin sat in a clearing beside a clear running creek, with a red barn and several outbuildings arranged nearby. Horses grazed in a fenced pasture, and she could see cattle dotting the distant hills. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows. It looked like home. It's not much, Dan said, noticing her expression, but it's peaceful, safe. It's perfect, Elizabeth whispered, and she meant it. They rode down the hill and into the yard, where Dan helped her dismount before taking care of the horses. A black and white dog came bounding out of the barn, tail wagging furiously. "That's Scout," Dan said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "He's friendly, but he might be a little excited to see new faces." As if to prove his point, Scout sat politely in front of Elizabeth and Lucy, his tail sweeping the dust as he waited for permission to approach. Elizabeth smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "Hello, Scout," she said softly, holding out her free hand for him to sniff. Dan watched the interaction with something like relief in his eyes. "Come on, let's get you both inside. Lucy needs rest, and you need a hot meal." The inside of the cabin was as welcoming as the outside. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable-looking chairs arranged around it. The kitchen was simple but well-equipped, and everything was clean and organized. Quilts hung on the walls and books filled a wooden shelf near the window. "This is beautiful," Elizabeth said, looking around. "Did you build it yourself?" "My father started it, and I finished it after he passed. Been working on improvements ever since." Dan hung his hat on a peg by the door and moved to stoke the fire. "Let me show you where you and Lucy will sleep." He led her to a small bedroom off the main room. It contained a comfortable-looking bed, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair positioned near the window. Someone had already prepared it for guests. There were fresh linens on the bed and wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. "You knew we were coming," Elizabeth observed. Dan looked slightly embarrassed. "I sent a telegram ahead from town while Dr. Mitchell was examining Lucy. Asked my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to get things ready. She keeps an eye on the place when I'm away." The thoughtfulness of it nearly brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. When was the last time anyone had thought ahead to her comfort? "The room across the hall is mine," Dan continued. "There's a door between them, but it has a lock on your side if that makes you feel more secure." Elizabeth nodded, touched by his consideration. "Thank you. Are you hungry? I make a decent beef stew, and there's fresh bread from Mrs. Patterson." For the first time in days, Elizabeth realized she was actually hungry. That sounds wonderful. They settled into an easy routine as Dan prepared dinner and Elizabeth tended to Lucy. The baby was definitely feeling better. She was more alert and had even managed a small smile when Scout came over to sniff her curiously. Over bowls of hearty stew and thick slices of bread with butter, they finally began to talk about the arrangement they'd made. "I need to be honest with you," Dan said, setting down his spoon. "I didn't make that offer entirely out of charity." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I really do need help here. The ranch is more than one person can handle properly, and—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've been alone for 3 years now. It gets pretty quiet." "What happened 3 years ago?" Dan's expression grew distant. "I was engaged to be married. Woman named Catherine Wells from back in Texas. We had it all planned out. The wedding, the life we'd build together. But a week before the ceremony, she decided she couldn't handle ranch life. Said it was too isolated, too hard. She married a banker instead." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "Don't be. She was probably right to leave. This life isn't for everyone." Dan met her eyes. "But I'm thinking maybe it might be for someone who knows what real hardship looks like. Someone who understands that isolation is better than desperation." Elizabeth considered this. "So this arrangement, it's not about romance? It's about mutual benefit," Dan said carefully. "You need security and a father figure for Lucy. I need companionship and help running this place. If something more develops over time," he shrugged, "we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And if it doesn't, then we'll still be partners. Friends, I hope. And Lucy will still have a home where she's wanted and protected." The practical nature of his proposal should have felt cold, but instead Elizabeth found it reassuring. There were no false promises, no unrealistic expectations. Just two people trying to build something better from the pieces of their broken lives. "What exactly would my responsibilities be?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, helping with the bookkeeping if you're able. Maybe helping with the animals during busy times like calving season. Nothing you're not comfortable with and nothing that would put Lucy at risk." "I can do all of that," Elizabeth said confidently. "I'm a good cook and I learn quickly." "I figured as much. Takes strength to survive what you've been through." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dan frowned. Visitors after dark were unusual in ranch country. He opened the door to reveal Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair. "Daniel, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I wanted to check on our guests and—" She lowered her voice. "There were some men in town earlier asking questions about the woman and baby you left with. Rough-looking fellows, not locals." Dan's expression hardened. "What kind of questions?" "Where you were taking them, how long you'd be gone, that sort of thing." I didn't like their manner, so I told them I didn't know anything. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Mayor Blackwood," she said, "he must have sent men after us." "Why would he do that?" Dan asked. "I paid the debts." "Because he doesn't like losing control," Elizabeth replied, remembering the mayor's expression when Dan had challenged him. "And because he probably had plans for me himself." Mrs. Patterson looked between them with understanding. "I see. Well, Daniel, you should know that these men were asking about the back trails to your place. They seem very interested in finding routes that wouldn't take them through town." Dan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he turned to Elizabeth. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "All right. Are you absolutely certain you want to go through with this arrangement? Because once we make it legal, once you take my name, there's no going back to your old life. These men, whatever they want, they'll be my problem too." Elizabeth looked down at Lucy, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time in weeks. Then she looked around the warm, safe cabin and finally at Dan's earnest face. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. Dan nodded slowly. "Then we'll need to make this official as soon as possible. Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to witness a wedding tomorrow?" The older woman's face broke into a smile. "I'd be honored. And Daniel, you might want to know, Reverend Mills is staying at my place overnight. He's traveling through to perform marriages for 3 other couples this week. I'm sure he'd be willing to add one more ceremony to his list." "Perfect." Dan turned back to Elizabeth. "If you're sure about this, we can be married tomorrow morning, before anyone has a chance to cause trouble." Elizabeth's heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "I'm sure." After Mrs. Patterson left, they sat by the fire making practical plans. The marriage certificate would give Elizabeth legal protection, and Lucy would officially become Dan's stepdaughter. They discussed finances, household responsibilities, and what they'd tell people about their unusual courtship. "One more thing," Dan said as they prepared to retire for the night. "I want you to know that you're not trapped here. If you ever decide this isn't working, if you want to leave, I'll help you get set up somewhere else. You'll always have choices, Elizabeth. I never want you to feel like you're back on that platform again." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As she settled Lucy in the crib Dan had hastily assembled in their room, Elizabeth marveled at how much her life had changed in a single day. This morning she'd been a desperate woman with no options. Tonight she was planning a wedding to a man she barely knew, but already trusted more than anyone she'd ever met. It wasn't the fairy tale romance little girls dreamed about, but it was something perhaps more valuable. A real partnership based on honesty, respect, and mutual need. And sometimes, Elizabeth thought as she drifted off to sleep, the most unexpected proposals turned out to be the most perfect ones. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the autumn leaves and carrying with it the faint sound of horses moving through the darkness. But inside the cabin, 3 people slept peacefully, unaware that their quiet happiness was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. Tomorrow would bring a wedding, new beginnings, and the first real taste of what it meant to be a family. But it would also bring danger, as the men Mrs. Patterson had seen finally found their way to Dan Carter's ranch. The honeymoon, such as it was, would be very short indeed. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Lucy's contented babbling and the rich aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For a moment, she forgot where she was, then reality came flooding back. Today was her wedding day. She sat up in the narrow bed, looking around the small room that was now hers. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden stars. Through the thin wall, she could hear Dan moving around the kitchen, the familiar sounds of a man starting his day. Lucy was awake in her makeshift crib, reaching for the bars and making the happy sounds that meant she was feeling much better. Elizabeth lifted her daughter and held her close, marveling at how much stronger the baby felt after just one night of proper rest and medicine. "Well, little one," she whispered, "today your mama becomes Mrs. Carter and you get a new papa. What do you think about that?" Lucy responded by grabbing a handful of Elizabeth's hair and trying to put it in her mouth, which Elizabeth took as approval. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Elizabeth, I've got coffee ready, and Mrs. Patterson should be here soon with Reverend Mills." "I'll be right out," she called, then quickly dressed in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but was clean and mended. She'd washed her hair the night before in the basin, and now she braided it neatly and pinned it up in a style that was practical but still feminine. When she emerged from the bedroom carrying Lucy, she found Dan standing by the stove, fully dressed in what were obviously his Sunday clothes. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and he'd shaved carefully. He looked handsome in a quiet, understated way that made Elizabeth's stomach flutter nervously. "Good morning," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Elizabeth admitted. "The silence here is wonderful. In town, there was always noise. Wagons, shouting, music from the saloon. This is so peaceful." Dan smiled. "Wait until spring when the birds really get going. You might change your mind about the silence." They ate breakfast together, eggs from Dan's chickens, bacon from his smokehouse, and biscuits that were surprisingly good for a bachelor's cooking. Elizabeth found herself relaxing, despite her nerves. Dan was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once he got comfortable. "I should warn you," he said as they cleaned up the dishes. "Mrs. Patterson is going to want to fuss over you. She's been trying to marry me off for the past 2 years, and she's going to consider this a personal victory. Does she know the circumstances of our arrangement? She knows we met yesterday and that it's a practical marriage. She doesn't know about the auction." Dan's voice was matter-of-fact. "I figured that was your story to tell or not tell, as you see fit." Elizabeth appreciated his discretion more than she could say. "Thank you. One thing, though," Dan continued, drying his hands on a dish towel. "People are going to assume this is a love match. Might be easier to let them think that than try to explain the real situation." "You mean we should pretend to be in love?" "Not pretend exactly. Just to not correct their assumptions." Dan looked slightly uncomfortable. "I'm not asking you to be affectionate or anything like that. Just don't feel like you have to explain our business to every curious neighbor." Before Elizabeth could respond, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Patterson driving up with a thin, elderly man in black clothes beside her. "That's Reverend Mills," Dan said. "He's a good man, been traveling this circuit for 30 years. He won't ask questions he doesn't need answers to." Mrs. Patterson bustled in, carrying a basket that smelled wonderfully of fresh bread and something sweet. "Good morning, you two. Daniel, you clean up nicely. Elizabeth, dear, you look lovely. And how's this precious little angel?" She made a beeline for Lucy, who smiled shyly from Elizabeth's arms. Reverend Mills followed more sedately, a kind-faced man with intelligent eyes and work-worn hands. "Daniel," he said, shaking hands with the groom, "it's been a while. I understand congratulations are in order." "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Reverend." "Not at all. I always enjoy performing marriages, especially when I can see the happiness in both faces." He turned to Elizabeth with a gentle smile. "And you must be the bride. Mrs. Patterson tells me you have a little daughter as well?" "Yes, sir. This is Lucy." "Well, Lucy, you're getting yourself a fine stepfather today. I've known Daniel since he was not much bigger than you are now, and he's grown into a man of excellent character." The ceremony itself was simple but surprisingly moving. They stood in front of the fireplace with Mrs. Patterson holding Lucy and acting as witness. Reverend Mills spoke about marriage as a partnership, about the importance of trust and commitment, and building something together that was stronger than either person could create alone. When it came time for vows, Dan and Elizabeth had agreed to use the traditional words, but as they spoke them, Elizabeth found herself meaning them more than she'd expected. "Do you, Daniel, take Elizabeth to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part. I do, Dan said, his voice steady and sure. Do you, Elizabeth, take Daniel to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Elizabeth looked into Dan's eyes and saw only kindness and determination. I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride. For a moment they both hesitated. Then Dan stepped closer and placed his hands gently on Elizabeth's shoulders. The kiss he gave her was soft and brief, more like a seal on a contract than a declaration of passion, but it was respectful and somehow perfect for what they were building together. Mrs. Patterson clapped and wiped her eyes. Oh, that was beautiful! And look, Lucy's clapping too. Indeed, the baby was waving her hands excitedly, delighted by all the attention and happy voices. After the Reverend and Mrs. Patterson left, Dan and Elizabeth found themselves alone as husband and wife for the first time. The awkwardness Elizabeth had expected didn't materialize. Instead, there was a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. So, Dan said, hanging up his good coat, what would you like to do on your first day as Mrs. Carter? Could you show me around the ranch? I'd like to understand how everything works. Dan's face lit up with genuine pleasure. I'd love to. They spent the afternoon touring the property. Dan showed her the barn where he kept the horses and the few milk cows, the chicken coop, the smokehouse and the root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved meat for winter. He explained his system for rotating the cattle between pastures and pointed out the boundaries of his land. Elizabeth was impressed by how well organized everything was. This wasn't the rough bachelor setup she'd expected, but a proper working ranch run by someone who took pride in his work. You've done all this yourself? She asked as they walked along the creek that provided water for the property. Mostly. I hire extra hands during branding and roundup, and neighbors help each other when needed. But day to day, yes, it's just been me and Scout. It's wonderful, Dan. You should be proud. Something in her tone made him stop walking and look at her. You really mean that? Of course I do. This is exactly the kind of place I dreamed of when James and I were first married. We always talked about having our own ranch someday. Elizabeth's voice grew wistful. He would have loved this place. Tell me about him, Dan said gently, if you want to. They sat on a fallen log by the creek while Lucy napped in Elizabeth's arms. Elizabeth found herself talking about James, his dreams, his sense of humor, his love for their daughter. Dan listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own memories of loss when appropriate. I loved him, Elizabeth said finally. I want you to know that. I'm not here because I'm trying to replace him. I know, Dan replied. And I'm not trying to replace him. A child should know about her real father, and you should be able to keep those memories. They're part of who you are. His understanding moved her deeply. Catherine, your fiancée, was she the love of your life? Dan considered this. I thought she was at the time, but looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of her than with who she really was. We wanted different things, had different ideas about what life should look like. It would have been a disaster. Do you think we want the same things? I think we both want security, peace, and a good life for Lucy. That's a pretty solid foundation. As the days passed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Elizabeth threw herself into making the house a true home, cooking meals that made Dan's eyes light up with appreciation, organizing the cluttered areas, and adding feminine touches that softened the bachelor's starkness. Dan, for his part, proved to be a natural with Lucy. The baby took to him immediately, reaching for him when he came in from working and babbling happily when he talked to her in his gentle way. Elizabeth often caught him carrying on one-sided conversations with Lucy as he did chores around the house, explaining what he was doing as if she could understand every word. You're good with children, Elizabeth observed one evening as she watched him rocking Lucy to sleep. I like babies, Dan admitted. They're honest. They either like you or they don't, and they're not shy about letting you know which it is. Did you and Catherine plan to have children? She wanted to wait until we were established. Dan said, using air quotes. Looking back, I think she just didn't want children at all, but was afraid to say so. Would you like more children? Eventually, I mean? Dan looked down at Lucy, then up at Elizabeth. If it happened naturally, I'd be happy about it. But there's no pressure, Elizabeth. I know this isn't that kind of marriage. But as the weeks passed, Elizabeth began to wonder if maybe it could become that kind of marriage. She caught herself watching Dan when he didn't know she was looking, admiring the way he moved with quiet confidence, the gentle way he handled Lucy, the respect he showed her in everything he said and did. She noticed little things about him, how he always made sure the coffee pot was full before he went out to do morning chores, knowing she'd want coffee when she woke up, how he'd started bringing her wildflowers from the pasture, claiming Scout had picked them for her, how he never failed to ask about her day and actually listened to the answer. One evening, about 3 weeks after the wedding, they were sitting by the fire after Lucy had gone to sleep. Elizabeth was mending one of Dan's shirts, and he was reading a book about cattle breeding. The domesticity of it made her heart ache with unexpected longing. Dan? She said suddenly. He looked up from his book. Are you happy? With this arrangement, I mean? He set the book aside and gave her his full attention. Yes, he said simply. Are you? Yes. More than I thought possible. Elizabeth set down her mending. I know we agreed this was purely practical, but I want you to know that you've given me more than just security. You've given me peace and hope. You've given me those things too, Dan said quietly. Plus the best biscuits in 3 counties and a daughter who thinks I hung the moon. She loves you, Elizabeth said. She lights up every time you walk in the room. The feeling's mutual. They looked at each other across the small space between their chairs, and Elizabeth felt something shift in the air between them. Not the desperate need that had driven her to the auction platform, but something warmer and more sustainable. Something that felt like the beginning of real love. Elizabeth, Dan said, his voice slightly husky, would it be all right if I kissed you? A real kiss this time? Instead of answering, Elizabeth rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat. Dan stood to meet her, and when their lips touched this time, it was with genuine affection and the promise of deeper feelings to come. When they broke apart, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. We're going to be all right, aren't we? She whispered. Better than all right, Dan murmured into her hair. We're going to be happy. Outside, unbeknownst to the couple growing closer by the fire, dark figures moved through the trees surrounding the ranch. Mayor Blackwood's men had finally found their quarry, and they weren't planning to leave empty-handed. The happiness Dan and Elizabeth had built was about to be tested in the worst possible way, but for tonight, holding each other in the flickering firelight, they were simply a man and woman falling in love despite themselves, building something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Tomorrow would bring danger, but tonight brought hope. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. The attack came at dawn, when the world was caught between darkness and light. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming softly as she worked. Lucy sat in the high chair Dan had built for her, contentedly gumming a piece of biscuit and watching her mother move around the room. The coffee was just beginning to brew, filling the air with its rich aroma. Dan had gone out early to check on a mare who was close to foaling, planning to return in time for breakfast. It was a routine they'd fallen into over the past month, peaceful mornings that began their days together as a family. That peace shattered when Scout began barking frantically from the yard. Elizabeth froze, her hand tightening on the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the eggs. Scout never barked like that unless something was seriously wrong. She moved to the window, careful to stay to one side as she peered out. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. 4 men on horseback sat at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the morning shadows. She recognized the leader immediately. Marcus Webb, one of Mayor Blackwood's collectors. The other 3 were strangers, but their hard faces and the casual way they wore their guns marked them as hired muscle. Elizabeth's first instinct was to call for Dan, but he was too far away to hear. Her second was to run, but there was nowhere to go with the baby. These men had surrounded the ranch. She could see movement in the trees indicating more riders positioned around the property. Instead, she did what pioneer women had done for generations when threatened. She prepared to defend her home. Moving quickly but quietly, Elizabeth retrieved Dan's shotgun from above the fireplace and checked to make sure it was loaded. Her hands shook, but her resolve was steady. No one was going to take her daughter. No one was going to destroy the new life she'd built. A heavy knock thundered against the front door, so forceful it rattled the frame. "Mrs. Carter," Webb's voice called out, dripping with false politeness. "Open up! We just want to talk." Elizabeth positioned herself behind the kitchen table, the shotgun trained on the door. "Say what you need to say from out there." "Now that's no way to treat visitors. We've come a long way to see you. I don't care if you've come from the moon. You're not welcome here." Webb's laughter was cold and ugly. "You always were a feisty one, weren't you, Elizabeth? But you can't hide behind that cowboy forever. Mayor Blackwood wants to discuss some unfinished business with you." "My debts were paid in full. I don't owe Blackwood anything." "This isn't about money, sweetheart. This is about respect, about what happens when people don't know their place." The door handle rattled as someone tried to force it open, but Dan had built the door well, and Elizabeth had thrown the heavy bar across it when Scout started barking. "Last chance, Elizabeth," Webb called. "Open this door or we'll open it for you, and if we have to break it down, we won't be near as gentle with you and that baby." Elizabeth's finger tightened on the trigger. "If you break down this door, you'll get a belly full of buckshot for your trouble. You think you can fight all four of us? We can wait you out, you know. Sooner or later, you'll have to come out. Or maybe we'll just burn you out." The casual way he mentioned burning made Elizabeth's stomach clench with terror. These men weren't just here to intimidate her. They were here to hurt her, possibly to kill her. That's when she heard the sound that made her heart soar with relief. Dan's voice, cold as winter steel, cutting through the morning air. "Step away from my house." Elizabeth risked a glance out the side window and saw Dan standing at the edge of the barn, his rifle aimed directly at Webb. Somehow he'd managed to circle around behind the intruders without being seen. Webb spun his horse around, his hand moving toward his gun, but Dan's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't. My rifle's loaded, and I don't miss what I aim at." "Well, well," Webb said, recovering his composure. "The hero returns. We were just having a friendly conversation with your wife about some business she has with Mayor Blackwood. Any business she had in Millbrook was settled when I paid her debts. You're trespassing on my land." "Legal technicalities," Webb waved dismissively. "The mayor has other concerns about Mrs. Carter's character. Seems he's heard some disturbing stories about how you two met." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with shame, but Dan's voice remained steady. "What my wife did before she married me is none of Blackwood's concern, or yours." "See, that's where you're wrong, cowboy. When a woman of questionable morals corrupts an honest man, the community has a responsibility to intervene." Dan's laugh was harsh. "Questionable morals? A woman trying to save her dying child has questionable morals? The only person here with questionable morals is you, Webb. Blackwood thinks differently. He's concerned about the influence she might have on other women in the territory. Bad examples need to be corrected. Then Blackwood can take his concerns and—" Webb's hand moved to his gun with surprising speed, but Dan was faster. The crack of the rifle echoed across the valley, and Webb screamed as the bullet shattered his shoulder, spinning him halfway around in his saddle. The other three men went for their weapons, but Dan was already working the bolt of his rifle, swinging it toward the next target. "Anyone else want to discuss my wife's character?" Dan asked conversationally. Instead of retreating, the remaining men spread out, trying to use their numbers to their advantage. Elizabeth realized that Dan, for all his skill, was outnumbered and exposed. If they rushed him from different directions, they might overwhelm him. She made a decision that would have terrified her a month ago, but felt natural now. These men were threatening her family, her husband, her child. Opening the door, Elizabeth stepped onto the porch with the shotgun raised. "The next man who moves toward my husband gets both barrels," she announced. The sight of the determined woman with a weapon she clearly knew how to use gave the remaining attackers pause. They'd expected to intimidate a helpless widow, not face a united front from two people willing to fight for their home. Webb, clutching his wounded shoulder, glared at them with pure hatred. You think this is over? You think Blackwood will just let this go? I think Blackwood should worry more about explaining to the territorial authorities why he sent armed men to attack a peaceful ranch, Dan replied, especially when one of those men ends up dead. We're not dead yet, Cowboy. That can be arranged, Elizabeth said calmly, never lowering the shotgun. For a moment, the standoff continued. Then Webb, realizing he was bleeding badly, and his men were clearly outmatched, jerked his reins around. This isn't finished, he snarled. Blackwood has a long memory and deep pockets. He'll find other ways to deal with you. Tell Blackwood that the next time he sends men to threaten my family, they won't be riding home, Dan said. Some things are worth killing for. Webb and his men retreated, but Elizabeth knew Dan was right. This wasn't over. Men like Blackwood didn't forget slights, and they didn't give up easily. As soon as the riders disappeared over the hill, Dan rushed to the porch where Elizabeth stood trembling with reaction. Are you all right? He asked, gently taking the shotgun from her shaking hands. I think so. Lucy is fine. I can hear her babbling in the kitchen. Indeed, Lucy's happy sounds drifted through the open door, completely oblivious to the danger that had just passed. Dan pulled Elizabeth into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel his heart racing, could sense the fear he'd been hiding behind his calm exterior. When I saw those men at our door, he murmured into her hair, when I realized they were threatening you and Lucy, I've never been so scared in my life. We're safe now, Elizabeth said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. For now. But Webb was right about one thing. Blackwood won't let this go. He'll try again, probably with more men next time. Elizabeth pulled back to look at him. Then what do? We make sure we're ready for him, and we make sure the territorial authorities know what kind of man they're dealing with. That afternoon, Dan rode into the nearest town to send telegrams to the territorial marshal and the governor's office, documenting Blackwood's harassment and the armed attack on their ranch. Elizabeth stayed behind with Lucy, cleaning and loading every weapon in the house. When Dan returned that evening, he brought news both good and bad. The territorial marshal is sending a deputy to investigate, he reported, but it'll be at least a week before he can get here. And the bad news? I heard talk in town. Blackwood's been spreading stories about you, about us, claiming you're a woman of loose morals who seduced an innocent rancher, and that he's trying to protect the community from your influence. Elizabeth's heart sank. Do people believe him? Some do, others don't. Mrs. Patterson made it very clear what she thought of anyone who believed such nonsense, and she's got influence with the church ladies. But Blackwood has money and political connections. That night, they took turns keeping watch, though the expected second attack never came. Blackwood was apparently regrouping, planning something more elaborate than a simple assault. As Elizabeth sat by the window during her watch shift, she reflected on how much had changed since that desperate day in Millbrook's town square. A month ago, she'd been willing to sacrifice everything for her daughter's life. Now she had something worth fighting for. Not just Lucy's future, but the life she'd built with Dan. The realization that she'd fallen completely in love with her husband should have surprised her, but it felt as natural as breathing. Somewhere between his gentle treatment of Lucy and his respectful kindness toward her, between the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, she'd lost her heart entirely. She loved the way he talked to Lucy, as if she were a full person deserving of conversation. She loved how he always asked about her day and listened to the answer. She loved his quiet strength, his unwavering principles, his willingness to fight for what mattered. And watching him defend their family today, seeing the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, she knew that what they had was worth any risk. When Dan came to relieve her at midnight, she pulled him aside. Dan, I need to tell you something. What is it? Today, when those men threatened our home, our family, I realized something. She took a deep breath. I love you, not because you saved me, not because I'm grateful, but because you're a good man who's become the center of my world. Dan's eyes widened in the moonlight. Elizabeth, I know this wasn't supposed to be that kind of marriage. I know we agreed it was practical, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just an arrangement. You and Lucy are my whole world now. Instead of answering with words, Dan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a passion that had been building for weeks. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you too," he whispered. "I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you on that platform. So brave and desperate and fierce. And every day since then, you've given me new reasons to love you more." "Whatever Blackwood does next, we'll face it together," Elizabeth said. "Together," Dan agreed. But even as they made their promises to each other, neither of them could imagine the depths of Blackwood's vindictiveness or the lengths he would go to destroy their happiness. The worst was yet to come, and it would test not just their love, but their very survival. For now, though, they had each other, they had Lucy, and they had a love worth fighting for. Sometimes that has to be enough to face whatever darkness comes next. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous young rider who barely paused long enough to hand it over before spurring his horse back toward town. Dan's face grew dark as he read the official-looking document. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, though she could tell from his expression that it wasn't good news. "A court order," Dan said grimly, "signed by Judge Harrison in the county seat. I'm being charged with unlawful interference with legal debt collection and harboring a woman of questionable moral character. There's going to be a hearing next week." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "They can do that?" "Apparently so. And get this, the complainant is listed as concerned citizens of Millbrook, represented by Mayor Blackwood in his capacity as community leader." "What does it mean for us?" Dan crumpled the telegram in his fist. "It means Blackwood found a legal way to attack us. If the judge rules against us, I could face fines, possible jail time, and—" He hesitated. "And what?" "They could take Lucy away, claim she's in an immoral environment and needs to be placed with a proper family." Elizabeth sank into a chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The thought of losing Lucy was more terrifying than any armed attack. "We have to fight this. There has to be something we can do." "There is," Dan said quietly. "We go to that hearing and we tell the truth. All of it." "Dan, if I tell them about the auction, about what I was willing to do—" Elizabeth's voice broke. "They'll use it against us. They'll say I'm exactly what Blackwood claims I am." "No," Dan said firmly, kneeling beside her chair. "They'll see a woman who loved her child so much she was willing to sacrifice everything to save her. They'll see someone who chose the hard path instead of the easy one." "You don't know that. You don't know how people will react." "I know how I reacted. I saw a woman worth saving, worth loving, worth fighting for. If other people can't see that, then they're the ones with the problem." But Elizabeth's fears proved justified over the following days. Word of the upcoming hearing spread throughout the territory, and with it came Blackwood's version of events. According to him, Elizabeth was a woman who had sold herself in the public square like common livestock. And Dan was a foolish man led astray by feminine wiles and misplaced sympathy. The whispers followed them everywhere. When Elizabeth went to town for supplies, conversation stopped when she entered stores. Some people looked at her with sympathy, but others stared with open disgust or morbid curiosity. Mrs. Patterson remained loyal, as did several other women who had seen Elizabeth's genuine care for Lucy and her contributions to the community. But they were outnumbered by those who found it easier to believe the worst than to examine their own prejudices. The worst moment came when Elizabeth was leaving the general store and overheard two women talking on the sidewalk. "I heard she actually stood on the auction platform," one whispered. "Can you imagine? Selling herself like a broodmare." "Well, what did you expect from someone like that?" the other replied. "Bad blood will tell. That poor man doesn't know what he's gotten himself into." Elizabeth hurried away, her cheeks burning with shame. But when she reached the wagon where Dan was waiting, he took one look at her face and his expression hardened. "What happened?" "Nothing. Just talk." "Elizabeth, look at me." When she finally met his eyes, he continued, "Whatever anyone said, whatever you heard, it doesn't change anything between us. You're my wife, Lucy is my daughter, and I will fight anyone who says different. Maybe they're right, though. Maybe you would have been better off without us." Dan's hands cupped her face gently but firmly. "Don't you ever say that again. You and Lucy are the best things that ever happened to me. Before you came along, I was just existing. Now I'm living." That night, as they sat by the fire planning their strategy for the hearing, a knock came at the door. Dan answered it cautiously, his hand resting on his gun, but relaxed when he saw who it was. "Deputy Marshal Thompson," he said, inviting the man inside. "I got your telegram saying you were coming to investigate the attack." Thompson was a weathered man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He accepted a cup of coffee and settled into a chair by the fire, his gaze taking in the comfortable domestic scene. "I've spent the last 3 days in Millbrook talking to people," he said without preamble. "Interesting town. Lot of folks seem to have strong opinions about you two." "I imagine they do," Dan said carefully. "Here's what I've learned," Thompson continued. "Mayor Blackwood is a man with ambitions beyond running a small frontier town. He's been using his position to increase his personal wealth and political influence. The attack on your ranch wasn't just about Mrs. Carter. It was about sending a message to anyone who might challenge his authority." Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. "So you believe our version of events?" "I believe the evidence. Webb was treated by the town doctor for a rifle wound to the shoulder. Several witnesses saw him and his men riding toward your ranch that morning. And I found this." He pulled out a folded paper. "A telegram from Blackwood to a man named Curtis in Denver. Professional gun for hire. Blackwood was arranging for additional men to come deal with the problem." Dan's jaw tightened. "So what can you do about it?" "Officially? I can arrest Webb and his associates for armed assault. I can investigate Blackwood's business dealings and see what other irregularities I find. But the hearing next week is a civil matter. I can't stop that." "But you could testify about what you found." "I could, and I will if you think it would help." Dan and Elizabeth exchanged glances. "It would help," Elizabeth said, "but I'm not sure it will be enough." Thompson studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Carter, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you regret what you did that day in town? The choice you made?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "I regret that I was in a position where I had to make that choice. I regret that my daughter was sick and I couldn't help her. But do I regret doing everything in my power to save her life? Number, I'd do it again if I had to." Thompson nodded approvingly. "That's what I hoped you'd say, because that's the answer of a good mother, not a woman of questionable character." The hearing was held in the courthouse at Cedar Falls, the county seat. Elizabeth had never seen so many people gathered in one place, all apparently eager to witness her humiliation. The courtroom was packed, with standing room only in the back. Judge Harrison was an elderly man with a stern face and penetrating eyes. He called the proceedings to order and listened as Blackwood's lawyer, an expensive attorney brought in from Denver, presented their case. The lawyer painted Elizabeth as a woman who had abandoned all moral decency, and Dan as a naive man taken in by feminine manipulation. He called witnesses who testified to Elizabeth's desperate financial situation, her husband's debts, and the scandalous scene in Millbrook's town square. When it was their turn, Dan and Elizabeth told their story simply and honestly. Dan spoke about finding a woman in crisis and offering help. Elizabeth, her voice steady despite her nerves, explained her decision to auction herself. "Your Honor," she said, "I stood on that platform because my daughter was dying and I had exhausted every other option. Was it dignified? Number, was it proper? Number, was it the act of a mother who would do anything to save her child's life?" "Yes." "And you feel no shame about this decision?" Judge Harrison asked. "I feel shame that society failed me so completely that I was driven to such desperation. I feel shame that my husband died leaving us in debt through no fault of our own. But I feel no shame for loving my daughter enough to sacrifice my pride to save her." Blackwood's lawyer tried to discredit Elizabeth's character further, but his efforts backfired when Deputy Marshal Thompson took the stand. The marshal presented evidence of Blackwood's corruption and the illegal attack on the ranch. He also testified to the loving home he'd witnessed during his investigation. "Judge Harrison," Thompson said, "I've seen a lot of families in my 20 years as a peace officer. What I saw at the Carter Ranch was a woman who had found security and love, a man who had found purpose and companionship, and a child who was thriving in a stable home. If that's immoral, then I don't understand the word. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson stood up in the gallery and asked permission to speak. "Your Honor, I've known Daniel Carter since he was a boy, and I was present at his wedding to Elizabeth. I've watched them build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I've seen Elizabeth care for sick neighbors, contribute to the church, and raise her daughter with love and wisdom." She turned to face the crowded courtroom. "And I want to say something to all of you who've come here today expecting a show. Elizabeth Carter is a better woman than most of us, because when faced with an impossible choice, she chose love over pride. How many of us can say we would have had that courage?" The courtroom was silent as Judge Harrison considered all the testimony. Finally, he spoke. "This case has forced me to consider some difficult questions about justice, morality, and the role of community in individual lives. The facts are these. Mrs. Carter found herself in desperate circumstances through no fault of her own. She made a choice that was unconventional and, yes, shocking to many sensibilities. Mr. Carter chose to help her in a way that was both generous and honorable." He paused, looking directly at Elizabeth. "Mrs. Carter, your actions on that day were indeed unusual, but I find no evidence that they harmed anyone or violated any law. What I do find is evidence of a mother's love and a community's failure to care for its most vulnerable members." Turning to Blackwood, his voice grew stern. "As for the allegations against Mr. Carter, I find them completely without merit. He acted as a good Samaritan and as an honorable man. The subsequent harassment you've subjected this family to is far more disturbing to this court than anything they have done. Therefore," Judge Harrison concluded, "I dismiss all charges against Mr. Carter. Furthermore, I'm ordering Mayor Blackwood to cease all harassment of the Carter family, and I'm recommending that the territorial authorities conduct a full investigation into his conduct in office." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry muttering. Elizabeth felt Dan's arm around her waist, supporting her as relief made her knees weak. But their victory was short-lived. As they left the courthouse, Blackwood intercepted them on the steps. "This isn't over," he hissed. "I have connections you can't imagine. I'll make sure you never have a moment's peace." "No," Dan said quietly. "It is over. Because if you come near my family again, legal or illegal, I'll kill you myself." The naked threat in his voice made Blackwood step back, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw fear in the corrupt mayor's eyes. As they rode home that evening, Elizabeth felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. They had faced their past, defended their choices, and emerged stronger than ever. "Do you think he'll keep bothering us?" she asked as the ranch came into view. "I think Blackwood's going to have bigger problems to worry about once the territorial authorities finish investigating him," Dan replied. "But even if he doesn't, we've proven something important today." "What's that?" "That when people try to tear apart what we've built, we're strong enough to fight back, together." That night, as they sat by the fire with Lucy playing on a quilt between them, Elizabeth marveled at how far they'd all come. A year ago, she'd been a desperate widow with no options. Now she was a woman with a family worth fighting for, love worth defending, and a future worth believing in. The road hadn't been easy, and it might not be smooth from here on out, but whatever came next, they would face it together, as a real family built on love, tested by adversity, and made stronger by everything they'd overcome. And sometimes that's the most beautiful love story of all. 6 months after the hearing, Elizabeth Carter stood on the porch of her home watching her husband teach their daughter to walk. Lucy, now 14 months old and sturdy on her feet, toddled between Dan's outstretched arms with delighted squeals of laughter. "Come on, sweetheart," Dan encouraged, crouching down with his arms wide. "Come to Papa." Lucy took 3 wobbly steps before tumbling into his embrace, both of them laughing as he scooped her up and spun her around. The sound of their joy filled the spring air like music. Elizabeth smiled, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child was growing. The baby was due in the fall, and Dan was already making plans to expand the house. They discussed names late into the evening last night, finally settling on James if it was a boy, honoring Elizabeth's first husband, and Catherine if it was a girl, after Dan's mother. "Mama!" Lucy called, reaching for Elizabeth with chubby arms. "Mama, see!" I saw you walking, sweet girl, Elizabeth said, taking her daughter from Dan's arms. You're getting so big and strong. Dan straightened, placing a gentle hand on Elizabeth's waist. How are you feeling today? Wonderful, she replied and meant it. The morning sickness had finally passed, and she felt energetic and content. Dr. Mitchell says everything is progressing perfectly. Good. Dan's eyes were soft with love and protectiveness. I want you to take it easy today. Mrs. Patterson said she'd come by to help with the canning. They'd hired 2 ranch hands over the winter as the cattle operation expanded, and Dan's hard work and smart investments were paying off. The ranch was prospering beyond their wildest dreams. But more importantly, their family was thriving. The vindication from the hearing had changed everything. Word had spread throughout the territory about Judge Harrison's decision and his pointed criticism of those who had attacked the Carter family. Public opinion had shifted dramatically in their favor, helped along by some surprising developments. Deputy Marshal Thompson's investigation of Mayor Blackwood had uncovered a web of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Blackwood was currently in prison awaiting trial on charges of embezzlement, bribery, and conspiracy. Several of his associates, including Marcus Webb, had fled the territory ahead of arrest warrants. The town of Millbrook had elected a new mayor, an honest farmer named Robert Jensen, who had publicly apologized to the Carter family for their treatment. He'd even invited them to be guests of honor at the town's upcoming Independence Day celebration. I still can't believe they want us to be grand marshals of the parade, Elizabeth said, shifting Lucy to her other hip. Believe it, Dan replied with amusement. Mrs. Patterson says half the territory is talking about the couple who faced down corruption and won. Apparently we've become some kind of folk heroes. I never wanted to be famous. You're not famous. You're just an inspiration. There's a difference. They were interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching. Dan shaded his eyes against the morning sun and smiled. Looks like we have visitors. The wagon carried a young woman with dark hair and a small boy who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. As it drew closer, Elizabeth could see that the woman's dress was worn and patched, and both she and the child looked thin and tired. Mrs. Carter, the woman called hesitantly as she climbed down from the wagon. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I heard, that is, people said you might be able to help. Elizabeth and Dan exchanged glances. Over the past few months, they'd received several visits from women in desperate circumstances. Word had somehow spread that the Carter Ranch was a place where people in trouble could find assistance. Of course, Elizabeth said warmly. Come inside and tell us what's wrong. Sarah's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with debts and a small child to support. She'd lost her farm to the bank and had been traveling for weeks looking for work or anyone willing to help. I heard about what you did, Sarah said, looking directly at Elizabeth, about how you were brave enough to offer yourself for sale to save your baby, and how this good man helped you build a new life. I was hoping maybe you'd know what someone like me should do. Dan and Elizabeth looked at each other, the same thought occurring to both of them simultaneously. Sarah, Dan said slowly, how would you feel about staying here for a while? We could use help with the house and the children, and there's plenty of room. I couldn't impose. It wouldn't be charity, Elizabeth interrupted. It would be a job. Room and board plus wages, and time to figure out your next step. What do you say? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Yes, I'd be grateful for the chance. As Dan helped Sarah unload her few belongings and settle into the spare room they'd prepared for such occasions, Elizabeth reflected on how much their lives had changed. They'd become not just a family, but a refuge for others facing the kind of desperation they'd once known. That evening, after Sarah and her son Tommy were settled and Lucy was asleep, Dan and Elizabeth sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. We're collecting strays, Dan observed with amusement. I prefer to think we're building a community, Elizabeth replied. People helping people. Isn't that what neighbors should do? Is that what we're calling it? Building a community? Elizabeth smiled. Well, I was thinking more along the lines of building a legacy, something Lucy and the new baby can be proud of. Dan pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. I love you, Elizabeth Carter. Have I mentioned that recently? Only every day, but I don't mind hearing it again. I love you. I love our life. I love what we've built together and what we're still building. Even the part where our house seems to be turning into a way station for lost souls. Especially that part, Dan said firmly. Every person we help is a reminder of how blessed we've been, how far we've come. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, feeling the baby flutter gently in her womb. Do you ever think about that day in the town square? About what would have happened if you hadn't ridden into Millbrook when you did? Every day, Dan admitted, and every day I thank God I was there at the right moment. I used to think it was just luck, Elizabeth said softly. Random chance that brought you to me when I needed you most. But now I think it was something more. Like what? Like maybe we were always meant to find each other. Maybe all the pain and loss we both went through was just preparation, getting us ready for what we could build together. Dan was quiet for a moment, considering this. You really believe that? I believe that love comes in many forms. The desperate love that made me stand on that platform. The generous love that made you stop and help a stranger. The growing love that brought us together as a real family. And now the abundant love that lets us help others the way you helped me. You make it sound like we're part of some grand plan. Maybe we are. Maybe everyone who finds their way to our door is part of it too. As if summoned by her words, Scout began barking in the distance. Dan stood up, alert to potential danger, but relaxed when he saw another wagon approaching in the fading light. This one carried an elderly couple and what appeared to be their granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 16. Like Sarah before them, they had the look of people who had lost everything and were hoping for a miracle. Should we see what they need? Dan asked. Elizabeth stood as well, her hand finding his. Of course. But first, let me ask you something. What? Are you happy, Dan? Really, truly happy with the life we've built? Dan looked at her, his wife carrying his child, ready to welcome more strangers into their home with an open heart, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. Elizabeth, a year ago I was a lonely man living a half-life, just going through the motions. Now I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead. I have a wife I love more than I thought possible, a daughter who thinks I hung the moon, another baby on the way, and apparently a house that's becoming famous for second chances. He cupped her face in his hands. So yes, I'm happy. Happier than I ever dared dream I could be. The wagon drew closer, and they could hear voices. Tired, hopeful, desperate voices that reminded them both of where they'd been and how far they'd come. Come on, Mrs. Carter, Dan said, offering her his arm. Let's go see what kind of help these folks need. As they walked toward the wagon together, Elizabeth marveled at the turn her life had taken. A year ago, she'd been a woman with no choices, standing on an auction platform offering herself for sale. Now she was a woman with a loving husband, a growing family, and the means to help others facing their own dark moments. The transformation hadn't been magic. It had been built through trust, respect, hard work, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure. But maybe that was the most magical thing of all. By the time they reached the wagon, the elderly man was climbing down slowly, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. Behind him, the woman held the young girl protectively. Evening, folks, Dan said kindly. I'm Dan Carter, and this is my wife, Elizabeth. Looks like you've had a long journey. We have indeed, the man replied. My name's Walter Hudson. This is my wife, Martha, and our granddaughter, Anne. We heard this might be a place where folks in trouble could find help. Elizabeth stepped forward, her smile warm and welcoming. Mr. Hudson, you heard right. Why don't you come inside and tell us your story? We'll get you fed and rested, and then we'll figure out how to help. As they led the Hudson family toward the house, Elizabeth felt the baby kick strongly, as if in approval. This child would grow up knowing that home was a place where love lived and strangers were welcome, where second chances were not just possible, but expected. It was a good legacy to leave. The story of Elizabeth and Dan Carter reminds us that sometimes the most desperate moments in our lives can become the foundation for something beautiful. What started as a transaction born of desperation became a love story that transformed not just two lives, but an entire community. Elizabeth's courage on that auction platform wasn't just about saving her daughter's life. It was about refusing to let circumstances define her worth as a person. She chose action over despair, hope over surrender, even when the cost seemed too high to bear. Dan's decision to help a stranger wasn't just about having money to spare. It was about recognizing that sometimes the most important investments we make are in other people's futures. He saw beyond the surface to the woman of character beneath, and his generosity created ripples that spread far beyond what he could have imagined. Their story shows us that love doesn't always arrive in the package we expect. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about passion at first sight, but about two people choosing to build something meaningful together, brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. In our modern world, we still face moments when we feel we have no good options, when circumstances seem to trap us in impossible situations. Elizabeth Carter's story reminds us that there's always another choice, even when we can't see it yet. Sometimes the courage to take that choice, even when it costs us everything we thought we valued, opens doors we never knew existed. And Dan's example shows us that we all have opportunities to be someone else's miracle. We might not be able to change the whole world, but we can change one person's world. And sometimes that one act of kindness changes our own world in return. The Carter Ranch became a symbol of second chances, a place where people could start over and build something better from the ashes of what they'd lost. But the real message of their story isn't about having a perfect ending. It's about having the courage to keep writing new chapters, even when the first ones were full of pain. Life on the frontier was hard, but it was also full of possibility. People could reinvent themselves, create new families, build communities based on mutual support rather than judgment. In many ways, we still live on a frontier, the frontier of human potential, where every day offers us the chance to be better than we were yesterday. So the next time you face an impossible choice, remember Elizabeth standing on that platform, choosing love over pride. The next time you see someone in need, remember Dan reaching for his wallet without hesitation. The next time you judge someone for the choices they've made, remember that you don't know what impossible circumstances led them there. And the next time you think it's too late for a second chance, remember that the best love stories often begin with the words, "I thought my life was over, but then," because sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come from the most desperate endings. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect. And sometimes the family you choose becomes more precious than the one you were born with. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to choose between pride and survival? Have you ever been someone's unexpected savior or had a stranger change your life? Share your thoughts and experiences below. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, love, and second chances from the American frontier. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and remember to like and share this story if you believe in the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances. Until next time, keep believing in second chances. Keep your hearts open to unexpected blessings. And remember that sometimes the most desperate deals turn out to be the best bargains of all. This has been Wild West Stories, where every ending is just a new beginning waiting to happen.